So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sri Vidya Iyer. Most people know me as Vidya. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill in Montreal, Canada. And I will be co-chairing this session with Dr. Zofia Slamka, who is a psychologist and social entrepreneur. She works with Origin Global on supporting youth mental health, service development, and policy in diverse settings. She's a research fellow at the London School of Economics and the co-founder of Let's See, the first youth mental health network of Central and Eastern Europe. So before we start, I do have an announcement, which is that those of you who've been participating in the Human Bingo, if you haven't got your answers yet, we're extending the time. So you have until the end of lunch tomorrow. So you still have a chance to win. So please do participate. It's till the end of lunch tomorrow. Okay? So the session today is titled Generational Impacts, and the focus is on really creating a deeper and broader understanding of generational impacts and challenges. We'll start by talking about generational thinking and generational trends, and then move to thinking about collectivist identity and cultural connection in the context of a hyper-connected and digital world, and then really think about the implications of this for mental health of young people and policy, both in the presentations, but also in the question and answer and discussion section. So that's kind of the goal for this session, and with that, I'll give it over to Zofia.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and welcome everyone. I hope you had nice lunch break. You're very lucky today because you will be hearing from amazing people and experts. I was very excited personally to be co-chairing this session with you. I work a lot in Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and in our youth mental health community we have really senior stakeholders and then very young stakeholders working together. And so that really means that I would see in the day-to-day practice what that generational impact really means, and I look forward to hearing everyone talking about this, and I'm sure we'll have some interesting questions as well. So to get us started, we are going to be welcoming Bobby Duffy to the stage in a moment. He is a real expert here. He is a professor of public policy and also the director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, where back in the day I did my PhD, so I'm very happy that we have colleagues reconnecting here. He has worked across most public policy areas globally, and his career spans over the last 30 years, so there's a lot of expertise and experience there. He worked across policy research and evaluation, and he was even seconded to the Prime Minister's strategy unit in the UK, so that sounds like something I want to know more about. He also sits on several advisory boards. I will name a few. He is chairing the Campaign for Social Science, the Closer Advisory Board, and is a member of the executive of the Academy of Social Sciences as well. Moreover, he's also a senior fellow of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. On top of this, he's an author, and he has published several books. The latest one, I guess, is of most relevance to us today, which is called Generations: Does When You're Born Shape Who You Are? And I want to know the answer to that question. This book came out in September 2021, and it challenges the myths and realities and stereotypes around generational trends, seeking a greater understanding around generational challenges. So welcome, and please enjoy the session.
Thank you so much for a lovely introduction, Sophia. So, as you said, let me go back. I'm going to talk about generational thinking and why I think that's important for understanding youth mental health trends. And if I was trying to sum up the analysis in the book in one sentence, it's that I think generational thinking is an incredibly powerful idea that's been horribly corrupted by terrible myths, stereotypes, and cliches. So when you look at the academic thinking, the history of the academic thinking on generations, it brings in some of the biggest thinkers that we've had in sociology and philosophy, including French philosopher Auguste Comte, who thought that generational change was the key determinant of the speed of societal change. So he said things like this: we should not hide the fact that our social progress rests essentially upon death. which I realize is not a massively cheery way to start a conference presentation. But what he meant was we get stuck in our ways once we get past a certain age. So the successive steps of humanity necessarily require a continuous renovation from one generation to the next. So these are really big ideas of life, death, societal change. So as someone who's been looking at generational trends and patterns for the last 15, 20 years, it is a real shame to me that the type and level of generation analysis that we get today is more stuff like this, that you'll see in the media, that millennials are killing the napkin industry, and I could fill the whole of this session just listing things that millennials are supposed to have killed, that you'll have seen in media headlines. So any millennials in the room, you should be ashamed of yourselves for this. But it's not just millennials who get stick in terms of generational labels, it's baby boomers too, not so much for killing things as ruining things. And in this case, ruining everything. This is an Atlantic piece about how boomers have ruined everything. And it just goes on down the generational patterns and trends. And Gen Z are obviously in the firing line now. And now this piece claiming that a poll shows that Generation Z are power-hungry hedonists. At least they have, in this case, they have the decency to put a question mark there. They're not entirely sure whether you are power-hungry hedonists if there's any Gen Z in the room, but you get the kind of pattern. And I think it is a real shame, because from this very simple fact is that you can only understand the future if you understand generations, because of this unshakable reality that older generations are dying out and being replaced by younger generations. So if there is something truly different between generations, knowing what that is really important, not just for understanding the past and present, but understanding the future. And this is, I use the simple 5-category social generations in lots of my work and our work in the book and elsewhere. And this is where it's really good to know your audience before, because I'm going to mildly insult lots of generations as I go through. So it's good to know who's in the room. By a quick show of hands, do we have any pre-war generation people? We tend not to get that many these days, but we sometimes do. I can't see any. Any baby boomers in the room? Hands up. Only a handful, so maybe just here. So these are the rich ones. So if you see them by the bar later, these are the ones that you've got to ask for a drink from. Any Generation X, the best generation? Yes, it's my audience, that's really good. Any millennials in the room? Lots of millennials, I expect. Yes, lots of millennials, and hopefully we've got a good few Gen Z as well. Yes, great. So we've got a great range of generations. So the job in the book is to separate, as Sophia said, separate myths and realities. But the real job is to apply this framework to separate period, life cycle, and cohort effects. So period effects are where something happens and we're all affected to some degree. That can be something really big, like a financial crisis, a pandemic, a war even nowadays, unfortunately. And it can also be really small things, like changing norms and fashions that happen over time. Then you do also have life cycle effects too. So a goose comp didn't mean that we completely stop changing once we get past a certain age. We do keep evolving as we go through different life stages, whether it's leaving home, getting a job, getting married, having kids, retiring. That still has a powerful effect on us and our relationship with society. And then finally, you've got cohort effects, which are the true generational effects, where a generation is different because of the circumstances it was brought up in, and they take some of that difference with them as they go through life. And I think going on to mental health more specifically, increased mental health challenges are definitely seen as generational, and you can see that very much in the popular literature around this. Jonathan Haidt's obviously very high-profile book on the anxious generation, putting generation in the title, but it builds on lots of other work too. Jean Twenge's Generations book looks across lots of issues, but has mental health really at its core as well. So they are seen as generational, and you can understand why when you look at the trends. I'll just pick out a couple. You'll know all of this better than me. and so I'll just pick out a couple from Jonathan Haidt's book on this, in this case, self-reported anxiety prevalence in the US. And you can see that there is a very strong relationship between age, so it's younger generations that have seen the biggest increases, and when you've got an age-specific effect at a particular point in time, that points to a cohort effect. And it's not just on self-reported measures, lots of other measures too. This one, an example of overnight mental health hospitalizations in Australia. And again, it's the younger groups that have gone up most in this period, particularly young women. And you can see that grey box on the chart. This is what Jonathan uses to signify the rise in social media and smartphones to kind of more or less universal levels. And that's obviously what Jonathan and that type of analysis is pointing to as the key driver of that. But that's not the only driver that people talk about in terms of explaining this generational element to the increase in mental ill health. And for the survey work, which I'm going to show you, I'm going to focus mostly on a new survey that we've done in Canada, and ahead of that, and work that we did in Australia with Origin and the UK. We did this simplified, simplistic categorization of explanations for change. And I have to say, this is not in any implied priority order, and it's very simplistic, and I'd love to hear from you for better classifications. So first, I've only got 5 factors that we looked at in the survey. First of all, you've got the new technology factors, particularly smartphones and social media. The second part of the Jonathan Haidt hypothesis really is that's alongside changes in parenting, regulation, increase in safetyism, which is leading to less or later resilience in young people. So basically, the hypothesis is overprotection in the real world combined with underprotection online is creating those types of conditions. But there's loads of other big factors that can explain these types of increases. A big one being the worsening socioeconomic conditions that young people in particular have been affected by, and the major shocks that have gone alongside those, things like the financial crisis and obviously the COVID pandemic hitting generations differently and particularly affecting young people. Then there's a fourth group of more cultural and societal shifts, I would say. And some of these are slower and longer term, but we could be reaching a point of tipping, or we could actually be creating conditions where these other shocks have more effects on people. Now, in that group, I have things like rising individualism, increased sense of precarity, including around climate, but around lots of other things. And then that's leading to a sense of pessimism and not helped by the loss of support that we've had, not just from services, but from communities, and that related to that individualism rise. And then finally, you've got a group around more identification type issues, whether it's better and or over-identification, where lots of that's a good thing, but lots of discussion about prevalence inflation, where it becomes a little bit self-fulfilling, or looping, where the meaning of the terms actually changes as they are used. So I'm going to try and make 3 points. With that framework in mind, we're going to try and make 3 points about what do the public think about this, based on a new survey that we've done in Canada and a study that we did in the UK and Australia jointly with the Origin Institute. So what do they think? What do people think first about the general trends for young people? And it's not very rosy, is the overview of this. The expectation of generation on generation and progress has gone in lots and lots of countries. This is from an Ipsos study asked across 32 countries around the world, just asking people to what extent, if at all, do you feel that today's youth will have a better or worse life than their parents, or will it be about the same? 32 countries. I'm not going to show you the top of the list, which India and China and many other countries still expect a better future in many ways. Just looking at the bottom 8, so the bottom quarter of that list of countries. And these are all countries where people are more likely to say things are going to be worse rather than better for kids compared to their parents. So you've got the US, Germany, Spain, UK, Canada, Japan, Belgium, and France. France at the bottom there. France are always really pessimistic about the future in any subject that you go to, but particularly on this. And we know that this is a new trend. This is a new pattern in at least some of these countries. We asked this question back in 2003-04 in the UK. Currently, only a quarter of people in the UK think things are going to be better for kids than it was for their parents, and half think it's going to be worse. Back in 2003, those percentages were flipped. so that it was half saying better and only a quarter saying worse. So this is a new feeling that we've lost that automatic sense of progress that we had at the beginning, in the post-war era. And you can understand why when you look at some of the realities of this, where the economic realities, I'll only show you one chart on the economic realities, where we've had an extraordinary concentration of wealth by generation in many different countries. I'll show you the US as an example. So this is the share of national wealth owned by each generation by the median cohort's age. So you have to compare people at a similar age on wealth, because you do tend to build it up as you get older. And you can just see baby boomers streaking away. And you can compare that, baby boomers with Gen X, when both were an average age of 45. Baby boomers owned 42% of all private wealth in the US. Generation X only had 15% of the wealth. And poor millennials not really getting going, Gen Z behind that. And it's worse than that in many ways from a kind of equity point of view, is because not every baby boomer made it big. It's only that wealth is concentrated in the top third of baby boomers, so it's going to flow down very unevenly to the next generation. Some people are going to get a lot, or are already getting a lot from the bank of mum and dad, but others are going to get nothing. So life chances are increasingly set by family resources as wealth has grown and become concentrated. This is in a new way, a new type of pattern. So this is the new data, some of the new data from Canada that we just released today, getting some media coverage today. And the bad news is it's seen as worse than even that for individual elements of life. So this is a question that we asked in Australia and UK and now Canada, just asking people across different sorts of areas, compared to when you were 18 to 29. This is asked of people aged 30 or over. Do you think each of the following has got better or worse for young people, or is it about the same? And there's an awful lot of red on here for worse, with mental health at the top. 7 in 10 people in Canada, older people in Canada, thinking it's got worse. Ability to afford things is next. Level of worry, future prospects, finding a job. All of these different elements seen as worse. And it's a very similar pattern when you look at young people themselves, very consistent across older and younger people. There's not a difference of views on this. Only just slightly even more pessimistic among young people themselves for each of these different types of factors, but in a very similar order. Of course, not everything is seen to have got worse for young people, and I look in the book and lots of other places about what's got better, but this is a powerful collection of things that have got worse for young people in people's minds. And it is a very similar pattern in the UK and Australia. This is not just something that you see here. This is comparing the data across each of the three countries, an incredible consistency and pessimism about this feeling that things have got worse across these three major countries. So, second point is that the public are clear that mental health has got worse. What do they think? What do they think is increasing mental ill health? Not the reality of it, but what do the public perceive is the case. So we just asked this question with a longer list than I'm going to show you. These are just the top answers. Which 3 or 4 of the following do you think are most important in explaining this increase in mental health problems? And there's quite a lot. I'm showing you all 3 countries here, so there's quite a lot going on in this chart. But it's easier if we kind of group it together into different types of factors. And first of all, there's these economic factors: increased cost of living, worse economic or employment prospects, higher levels of housing and unstable housing and homelessness. And you can see the big story that the Canadian media picked up on is obviously the increased cost of living in Canada really standing out. 60% plus of people picking that out as a reason for increase in mental health problems among young people. Only 4 in 10 in the UK and Australia. And we were going through a cost of living crisis, at least in the UK at that time as well. But then there is a second group of the more technological explanations. People do see increased social media use, and then more generally IT, increased smartphones and the internet more generally as an issue. And they do recognize the impact of big shocks on particularly COVID-19, more so in Australia and the UK than Canada. And that might be because the Canadian study is just a little bit later than the UK and Australian one. It shows you how quickly people move on from these. And then the increased use of drugs and alcohol comes out in this kind of mid-table position, but that's a balance of completely different views between young and old on this. Old people think it's drugs and alcohol issue. Young people really don't think it is a drugs and alcohol issue, which we find across different types of countries. Gen Z themselves are more likely to say this is an economic, employment and housing issue for them. They've got higher ratings of that than older people. But I suppose the main takeaway from this type of question for me is that the public have an instinct that there are a number of drivers, that there isn't just one simple explanation to this. They get the sense that this is complex and interconnected, which is important. The third point I wanted to make is that we might expect skepticism about how real the increase is, rather than this being down to a generation of snowflakes coming through into young people. Because it is an absolute truth of history that thinking today's young are uniquely wrong or weak is an absolute constant of history. You can go to any era, famously all the way back to Socrates. In 400 BC, Socrates said, "The children now love luxury." This is a really long diatribe that Socrates had against young people of his day. They love luxury, they have bad manners, they show disrespect for their elders and love gossip in the place of activity. And we actually polled this in the UK, these exact wordings from Socrates, and over half of the UK public agree that's true of young people today in the UK. So nothing changes. But like I say, you can go to any era, 1771, a letter to the Town and Country magazine, I like this one, "A race of effeminate, self-admiring, emaciated fribbles," which is such a lovely turn of phrase, and more or less a definition of snowflake just 250 years before we had that term. And I think we can agree that it feels more divided by generations now than it has in the past. And I think there's two main reasons for that. One, I'm not going to say very much at all about our more fractious media, social media and politics. We'll look at that a lot in my other book, and lots of great analysis out there on the reality of how divisive and conflict-inducing that environment is. But there's one thing that I think is less recognised that is worth flagging, is that we're living more separately by age than at any time in our history, which we haven't really focused on as much. They have a bit more in the US. There's academics there who talk about us living through a dangerous experiment in age segregation, but it's not just a US issue. This is some great work by the Centre for Towns in the UK, from a couple of years ago, which just looked at the old age dependency ratio, so the proportion of retirement age people versus the proportion of working age people in different types of settlement. So from villages through towns, small to large towns, and then up to the biggest core cities in the UK. And you can see in 1981 census, 1991, there was no difference in the age profile on this measure. There was no big difference whether you're in a village or a city. Age profile was pretty similar between those different types of settlement. But then since then, we've had this enormous splaying apart where towns and villages are getting older and cities and large towns are getting younger to really big degrees. These are not small changes in this type of demographic factor. And Tom Calver, a data journalist at the Sunday Times that we worked with, has updated this for the 2021 census. Even though it was a weird time of COVID and people returning home, the pattern is kind of maintained since then. It's not actually switched back. So we are living much, much more separately. And what we know, and what you will all know better than me, is that kind of separation fuels stereotyping. When you don't have much contact with the other side, you start to stereotype who they are and what they do. And you can see lots of that in discussions of Gen Z. Gen Z are entitled in the most difficult generation in the workplace. The workplace is one of the noisiest engines of generational myths. And it's through work like this, which doesn't have a lot of truth in it. But then more generally, just criticizing generations, Gen Z in particular. Why can't Gen Z cope with the real world? I'll tell you why, said this middle-aged man, which was the person who wrote it. And that's not to say only old for talking down to young. It does go in both directions. This separation encourages misunderstanding in both directions. Some of it is just good fun, I think, in some ways. Anyone seen this group? a Facebook group called A Group Where We All Pretend to Be Boomers. Anyone been on that? It was set up by two 20-year-old Americans where the only rule is you have to post as if you're a baby boomer. So you don't understand the rules of social media. And it's got some great stuff. Lots of capitalized political rants against people, various people. Lots of disgusting medical queries from older people. And the ones that make me giggle the most, which I think says most to me, is these ones of very sad messages on very happy backgrounds from people. And the interesting thing about this is when you look at the interviews, so it's good fun, it's worth a look, it's still going, they're talking about Trump and the price of eggs now, it's all that sort of stuff. The interesting thing, when you look at the interviews that the founders and moderators do this, they have to moderate it incredibly actively because it tips into really destructive stereotypes of old people very quickly, misogynistic and racist and all sorts of things. They have to make it really keep a very close eye on it because of that cliched view tipping into very negative views. And then this is half a line on this presentation. It's much more in the book, and it just reflects what Sophia was saying at the beginning. We're also losing that benefit of intergenerational connection, and that's a lot of the work that we do, is how do you bring the generations together in more productive ways. So given that type of context of stereotypes and cliches, you might expect public opinion to focus on weak young people or coddling as an explanation for this increase in common mental health disorders and mental ill health. But actually, when you look at the Canadian data and the Australian and UK data, there's actually significant nuance and sympathy but among all generations for the position of young people on this. And there's a real mix of views on how real the change is and why it is happening. And this is my final kind of data slide on this. And what we did was just do a little segmentation based on 3 questions. Do you think the increase is real change from the past? Or are we just better at identifying mental ill health than we were in the past? And it was just as common back then. Then those who were asked if it thought it was real were asked whether it's because of tougher circumstances facing young people or whether it's because the youth themselves are less resilient. And then if you didn't think it was real, you were just asked, is it a good thing or a bad thing that we're identifying it better at identifying it among young people? And this is how it comes out. The first bit's not very interesting. 18% of people don't know on this sort of thing. I do think that's a sign of a good segmentation. If you're not getting 10 to 20% of people who just don't care what you're talking about, that's a sign that your segmentation is probably not working that well. But more substantively, one of the bigger groups is the 24%, a quarter of people think it's a real increase because circumstances have got tougher. This is of the Canadian public. And that's more than the 17% of people who think it's a real increase, but that's because youth are less resilient than they were in the past, the kind of coddling snowflake type idea. And then the biggest group are the people who think it's not a real increase, we're just better, we've got greater identification than we did in the past. So there's a negative spin on this type of data, which if you group those two things together, that would end up saying 58% of Canadians think mental health among young people isn't really worse in the past, or it's because of young people themselves. But I don't think that's the real story or the full story of this data, because of that third question that we went on to ask of people who didn't think it was a real change, is it a good or a bad thing? And the vast majority, 3/4 of people think it's a good thing that we're better at identifying mental ill health than they were in the past, much more than people who think it's a bad thing. So it's actually quite a positive, nuanced picture among the public who are not saying this is just a coddled generation, much less likely to say it's just because they're less resilient. And actually they think it's a good thing that we are better at identifying it than we were in the past. So just final thoughts from me. Why should we care, I suppose, about public opinion on this? And I think there is a key point here is because political decisions are important, as they will drive policy responses, and politicians really do care about what the public think and where their sympathies lies. So I would say the 2 key messages that we should be taking from this, from policy engagement point of view, is that the public really do recognise that things have got tougher for young people. That is an authentic view among the public. But then secondly, they are instinctively think that the causes for this increase is multidimensional. There's not one simple answer to this. They get that this is complicated and has lots of different drivers and will need lots of different responses. And I think that's important in the context of the political appeal. There is a political appeal of solely focusing on social media and smartphones. It does land well with people, and it's partly my day job is to run a policy institute, so it's about translating research into policy impact. And when you look at policy assessment frameworks, they always have efficiency and feasibility really high up the list. Is there a lever that I can pull that will help this, and does it cost very much or not very much? So that you can understand the appeal from that. And you can also understand that policymakers are subject to the same biases as we all are. We all prefer one simple cause because it then points to one simple solution. But I think this is a case, and I think the public recognise that this is the case, that for every complex problem there's a simple answer and it's wrong. And I think that this is one of these instances. But it does present a challenge for us in policy and political engagement. We ran a session at the UK Parliament recently on a whole range of generational related things, and there was a UK MP, now a minister actually, who had a complaint, who just said, you just tell me it's very complicated, or alternatively, we need to change everything. The whole context is so tough, and that is hard for policy makers to take. And this is where, final point, where I think putting it in this generational context is really important. You can't just look at it in isolation. You need to look at it across all the different generational trends and drivers that we've seen, and what we've seen among broader generational change that has led to this point, not seeing it as disconnected from all these other things. And that's the real value, I think, of a generational frame to this. So my overall point on generational analysis is this, that we need to challenge the simplistic generational takes, all the stereotypes, myths, and cliches, but not drop the generational thinking, because I think that's still incredibly powerful in understanding what's happening and what's going to come next. But I'm a bit of an outlier. Some of this, there are academics in the US calling for us to ditch this type of generational label type analysis because it does mislead people. But then that may be partly my own biases in this, because I am Gen X, as I said at the beginning, and no one ever talks about us. We get zero criticism at all. I'm very much with the UK journalist Jonathan Walker, who says, I'm neither a millennial nor a boomer. I come from a generation so irrelevant that people can't even be bothered to hate us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Bobby Duffy. It was fun, engaging, and at the same time really thought-provoking, like helping us really think and unpack some of the assumptions we make about generations, why it's important to look at this more critically. I also thought the part that you spoke about, throughout this conference, I think some of these same questions have been coming up in many presentations. Is there a real increase in mental health? Is there a real increase in tough conditions for young people? And what is the public opinion about why that may be the case? So it was really, really interesting. And maybe the slide about intergenerational connection, I think that really resonated with me. I have the privilege of working with many Indigenous communities in Canada, and I think that comes very, very much part of the fabric of that is valuing and privileging intergenerational connection as key to young people's well-being. I'm going to now move to the next. So I'm going to introduce Avneet Dillon, who is a PhD student in rehabilitation sciences at the University of British Columbia. She's also been the co-chair of the program committee and has worked really hard to bring together many parts of this conference. She will be introducing the next part of this session and also facilitating it. Welcome, Avneet.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I hope you're all enjoying the conference, and thank you, Dr. Bobby Duffy, for that amazing chat, and it flows really well into what we're about to talk about. Before I begin our fireside chat, I'd actually like to begin with a land acknowledgement, one that I start a lot of my presentations with. So in 1914, the Kamogatamaru, a Japanese steamship, carried 376 South Asian immigrants from Hong Kong to Vancouver. Among those immigrants were 372 men, 2 women, and 4 children. On May 21st, 1914, this ship arrived outside the very waters outside that we see in these windows. However, none of the passengers were allowed to disembark. The Canadian government blocked their attempts to challenge this decision in court and refused to supply them with food and water. After months of being stranded, the Kamogatamaru was forced to leave on July 23, 1914, and when it arrived back in India, British colonial authorities labeled the return of the passengers as extremists. This led to violent clashes, resulting in the death of many of those aboard the ship. While this story is a painful reminder of colonialism and exclusion, there's also an important lesson in solidarity. During this time, it was the Coast Salish peoples who extended mutual aid to the stranded passengers, paddling out in canoes and bringing them food and supplies. These acts of care remain a part of both Indigenous oral history and also the South Asian history. And many South Asian migrants refer to their Indigenous friends as taike, which means elder cousins. And I'm grateful for these relationships and hope to continue to reassert this kinship with the Coast Salish people. For anyone who's interested in learning more, there's a lot of murals you can visit dedicated to this history in Vancouver and also in Stanley Park just around the corner. And feel free to talk to me if you're interested in learning more about this as well. Thank you. So finally, for the introductions, my name is Avneet Dhillon. I'm a first-generation Punjabi youth currently pursuing my PhD at UBC under the mentorship of Dr. Sky Barbik. My research focuses a lot on culturally sensitive care, particularly within South Asian communities. And I wear a lot of different hats while working in the community, working within substance use and harm reduction, volunteering in the community, and also as a young person with lived experience. I'm excited to be here today alongside my friend, Abel Paul George. Abel is a Malay youth and American design futurist whose work spans tech, consumer products, design, and strategy, and his impact extends to over a dozen Fortune 500 companies which are shaping culture at the intersection of all these disciplines. So at first glance, Abel and I come from very different worlds. We have research and academia on one side, design and innovation on the other. But at our core, we are both passionate about bridging industries and creating solutions that are both innovative and mostly culturally resonant. As Dr. Pat McGorry mentioned earlier in the conference, collaboration and spillover across multiple sectors is what's key to tackling complex issues, and that's exactly what we're committed to do today. What also makes this even more special is after years of friendship and collaboration, this is actually the first time Abel and I are meeting in person. And fittingly, we're diving straight into the topic that brought us together in the first place, which is digital communities and their intergenerational impact through belonging and mental well-being.
Good afternoon, everyone. How's everybody feeling today? Good? Good? Awesome. So as Avneet mentioned, we come from different backgrounds. She comes from just the special area of even being in Canada and working amongst this field. For me, I work as a design futurist, and again, that's a weird term, and so I like to define that. I've worked kind of in a weird way of inserting myself and kind of riding under the radar and going into, for lack of a better term, collective cultures and being able to infiltrate and help teams build that, whether that's a fashion label, and as Bobby said, using and understanding generations to build into maybe a recurring theme, with tech startups to understand, okay, how do we acquire a certain user base, whether that's a young child or a younger generation or an older generation for a certain use case, or even how we met across Instagram, social network, and even that mix of music and fashion and all that culture. So for me, I work and operate in a lot of these spaces across different organizations or industries to help advise and build that. But one thing I come from, and one thing I'm starting to see as we have conversations, is that I come from, myself anecdotally as a South Asian, and that's where both of us align, we come from primarily identities that are collectivist in nature, that play an inherently a huge role in our individual identities. And so for me, as I step in and build on primarily digital communities and communities that are kind of centralized around those spheres, there is a huge history and a long history of traditionally familial, and again, in the South Asian community, where that orients and almost in some cases may dictate where a lot of people stand in their kind of individual outputs and identities. So that's where, for me, as someone, as a designer, I tend to get into this, like I say, like anthropologist bag, and I start stepping into this place where I go to somebody like a special interest expert like Avneet within South Asian studies to ask, as individuals, and I go back to my own community after I'm done with work at the end of the day and want to help out. And want to help the young kids that are, again, battling even how they navigate their individualism. And so for you, Avneet, I would love to ask, especially as I go into design and talking about that, I think it would be great to set the precedence about what it looks like specifically from a South Asian standpoint, the strengths and the weaknesses, to look into that.
Yeah, so for those of you who are not familiar with the term collectivism, I'll briefly define it here. So it's a cultural value system in which individuals see themselves as a part of a larger group. So this could be a community, it could be a nation, but what we're going to be specifically talking about is family. And they prioritize this group harmony, interdependence, and shared responsibility, sometimes over personal goals and also their personal mental well-being. This is contrasted with individualism, which emphasizes personal autonomy and self-reliance, which is something we see more in Western healthcare, and especially when we're creating mental health services. A lot of it, I find, is focused on individualism. So traditional collectivism is not bad. It actually has a lot of positives. So creating strong social support networks, reducing loneliness and isolation, and all the other positive effects we see within communities and coming together. As a health services researcher, when I began working with South Asian young people, I really went in with understanding how can we make the services better? What are these young people saying about the services, and what are their opinions about it? But I really quickly realized that both through my data and anecdotally, that these young group of South Asian individuals are at a very high risk of mental health and are having significantly lower access rates to these services. So they haven't even accessed these services. They don't know much about them. So I kept thinking, well, where are youth going, and what are they looking for, and how can we bring them to these services? And after speaking with dozens of South Asian youth, I realized they weren't as keen about talking about the services, but they kept coming back to this idea of collectivism and wanting to talk about their parents, their families, their cousins and friends, and seeing how that is impacting their mental health and also acting as a barrier. So again, traditionally, collectivism is seen as a positive thing, but now I was realizing that South Asian young people are now citing this as, if not one of the largest causes of mental health distress and barrier to accessing services. And that's when I quickly realized that the notion of sacrifice, community, and collectivism is not simply just an act of love. It's a binding contract between generations, and with its positives also come a lot of negatives. So there are three major themes that were coming up when speaking with young people. The first one that I'm sure a lot of South Asians in the room can relate to is this idea of log kya kahenge, and it translates to what will people say. So this is not just a phrase, but it's a deeply rooted, ingrained mindset that shapes everything from career choices, relationships, who you're going to date, and even mental health, and if you are even able to access a service. This leads to South Asian young people having a huge lack of autonomy. So in collectivist cultures, the family isn't just a support system, it's an extension of oneself. So individual choices, whether it's speaking about your mental health or accessing a service or speaking with a clinician, it's not an individual choice, but these South Asian young people are forced to think about how they reflect the family as a whole. So these young people don't always feel like they have the freedom to make their own choices because their choices are not simply about them. Parents and elders are steering their life decisions, and not out of control, but because of this deeply rooted collectivism and responsibility, which has been ongoing for generations. I want to quote an amazing young person that I had the pleasure to speak to. They say, trying to fit into this roadmap that was made for me, it was made without any awareness of trauma, any awareness of self-care or wellness. The struggle between expectation and self-identity can be exhausting, especially when it's a deviation from the norm in my family, and it's not seen as an individual choice, but a failure of my family unit. This ties into the next part, which we're seeing a lot, is the idea of immigrant guilt that cycles through and flows through generations. And it's this idea that if our previous generations endured racism, financial hardship, emotional distress with support, then why do I need help? Why do I need to go speak to someone if the previous generations were able to go through so much? And many youth feel like they're letting their families down by struggling, which creates this like indefinite indebtedness cycle. A participant said, "I didn't want to say when I needed help because I knew my parents sacrificed so much for me to get here." So in a collectivist framework, it's not just an individual experience, it's intergenerational. So young people are starting to feel responsible not just for their own well-being, but for validating the sacrifices of those who came before them. And the last one I want to talk about, which ties into the concept of individualism, is trying to navigate both Western and Eastern values at the same time. In Western societies, we have a heavy emphasis on individuals, finding your own path, prioritizing personal happiness, setting boundaries. But in collectivist cultures, these ideas don't always translate. Oftentimes, I myself have been told, and other young people have been told, that setting a boundary is selfish. Prioritizing your well-being over family obligations can feel like betrayal. Youth also talked about feeling pulled in two directions. So when their family would expect them to uphold certain generational traditions, but then with their Western peers, they felt like they weren't being understood or being judged for the same values, which was creating then a sense of isolation where you don't really fully belong anywhere, not at home, not outside, not in your generation. So all this was really helpful in understanding the complexities, but still didn't really answer my question about like, okay, well then where are young people going for support? Like if they're not engaging in these collectivist communities that they have at home, where are they going? And that came up in my research and also my conversation with Abel and the world that he's in. And we're seeing that young South Asian people are reinventing essentially what collectivism means to them. They're not throwing away that idea, but bringing it into new spaces that they're in, including social media and digitally hyper-connected worlds. Which brings me to my question to Abel, who has met a lot of South Asian young people in this new world of collectivism. So South Asian collectivism historically has provided security, but digital spaces are now shifting on how younger generations are defining belonging. How do you see this transition playing out, particularly in cultural narratives within the South Asian community and also outside?
Yeah, for sure. It's an interesting moment. I would say it's kind of teeter-tottering at this crux where it's an interesting time, and some may see it as an opportunity moment, and see it as a moment to really grab it and take the mantle, and some see it as a point of displacement. Again, there's a lot coming from a traditional background, and again from that nature of collectivism to a hyper-individualized moment, or where most of your communities are primarily in digital spaces, to where again there was a dictation moment to where these people dictated things such as your career, who you married, or even where you lived. And now there's kind of a moment of independence, and it's almost overwhelming to some, but to some it might be liberating, and there's a lot of things that might be imposed, there are a lot of things that might be inherited, and then that creates this really unique evolution that happens from there. And there's a really big archivist culture where people are beginning, as young people, to understand and share that knowledge base amongst others outside of their own communities to be able to grow and share that knowledge. But it's at an interesting point to where I would say primarily it requires new models. It requires new things to where formerly things that are rule books are now toolkits to build, and rather than prescriptive walls that are around it, it's adaptable doors that are opening for young people to step into new spaces and things, but with the benefits of what they come from, the communities that they come from, to orient that into new spaces that they're walking into and stepping into.
Bring up this idea of a new framework or a new collectivist framework. What does it look like for a sustainable future to keep elements of like generational collectivism, but like redefine it?
Yeah, a lot of it, and again, it's just thinking about a model and building upon that. I think the biggest thing is dialogue, is the ability between generations to have that conversation moment that often isn't had, and defining these needs and desires and inherent things that you want to step into, and that people may have opinions and things about. There's also the idea of these hybrid communities that we're stepping into spaces that, again, former generations aren't privy to, whether that be online or associated, kind of mixes of these certain niches and communities that are interest groups for young people that then find its own identity and then get made. And then being able to step into those things where, again, as young people too, we carry this point to where we're introducing those things to a generation that hasn't seen that before. And there's a really unique opportunity, again, to carry that mantle together where collectivism isn't dead or forgotten, but the benefits are carried over into what's to come.
So that leads me into my point to speak to a group of researchers and academics. And you might think, well, what does this mean for us? And I think it means for us is that addressing stigma like collectivism is just not about raising awareness. It's about recognizing how deeply it is rooted into communities and how it can shape these experiences. I think if we want mental health services to truly support South Asian young people, we have to account for these cultural nuances and remembering that for many young people, mental health isn't just about personal well-being. I often hear us advocate for, and like I am guilty of this too, culturally sensitive care for the individual. Yet we overlook the fact that some young people, becoming an individual is a process, and many young people won't ever fully be able to experience that. So I think rather than centering all of our efforts on services designed for individual healing, we must embody this new collectivism that Abel talks about, one that acknowledges the roles of families, one that acknowledges the positives of digital communities and social media in shaping young people's mental health. So this means creating supports with working with elders, working with families, and then extending care to their youth, rather than assuming that all young people are going to be navigating these challenges alone. It also means recognizing that although digital spaces, despite their risks, offer opportunities for connection and solidarity and healing that maybe traditional mental health services often overlook. Like we see right here, me and Abel are sitting simply because of a digital space, and even in the front row in front of me, we all almost know each other, all our South Asian researchers, because of these digital spaces and leaving the collectivist community we might have at home and building new ones. And I think if we fail to integrate these perspectives, we risk leaving a lot of young people out of the conversation. So instead of reinforcing individualistic ideologies that may not resonate with all people, including myself, we must reimagine what this care looks like. And this is something that Abel was talking to me about as well, is that younger generations are not just passive recipients of culture, they're active architects of what collectivism and this culture looks like moving forward. And I encourage all of you to create spaces where this tradition will serves more as a resource rather than a constraint for you.
For sure, yeah, there's that moment of analysis that leads intuition into imagination. And I think that's really important for generations of all kinds to go into together. I had this conversation from our conversation to an older brother of mine who has 3 children, and there was just a moment, just anecdotally, where he was sharing that after reading our work and kind of what we were preparing for, that he had to go upstairs and just take a look at his 3 kids and realize that they don't owe me anything. And moments like that, though so small, play such a key moment into the livelihoods of what those kids will become. And I think it's important that as different generations that we have those moments together and we come into a realization that allows us to imagine. And so I think that's really important. It's the beginning of something new that we can really step into.
Yeah, and we have a couple minutes left here, but I just want to end off by just acknowledging like the young people, both in South Asian communities and outside of South Asian communities, who may not have the resources or ability, because to be a cycle breaker and to like step out of that traditional collectivist framework is really difficult. So yeah, just want to, acknowledge and think about the people who maybe need some support doing that, or maybe we'll never reach that point.
Yep. Awesome. But yeah, I think I'm really excited, and again, more conversations, like I said, are necessary, and it's just it's a riveting point in time to be in where we can be able to have these now. We've had this conversation for years digitally, and now to be able to step into that physically and be able to in turn do that across generations is important. So I'm excited for it.
Yeah, and again, like I encourage everyone in this room to speak with people who are maybe outside of research and academia, because they have an access to a different subset of young people that we don't. Like even today when Abel posted on his story saying that he's in Vancouver and there were so many young South Asian people who wanted to meet with him. And for me, it's like, I want to speak to those young people as well, because I find like in the mental health space, you're sometimes catering to the same subgroup who may be passionate about mental health. So I think this type of collaboration is like really important to get a true understanding of like what's happening within our communities.
But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We now have some time for questions.
That's great.
So feel free to send questions on the app, on the chat, or just come up to the mics and address all or either of the speakers. We've got someone in the back if you would like to start.
Yeah, I was just wondering, what kind of advice do you guys suggest to help youth feel more comfortable? For example, just the language and cultural barriers, but also like what kind of training and workshops would you suggest clinicians and researchers to go into so then they can help the youth feel more comfortable?
Maybe this one's for Avneet.
Yeah. I think although trainings, and that's important, I think the best way to build connections with youth is actually meeting them where they are and building rapport with them and building trust with them. At least for me, the best connections that I've made with young people is by being with them and almost being like their friend rather than a researcher. And I feel like we've had these conversations a lot through this, is how do we engage young people? And yeah, I don't know if there's a specific training or format, but I just encourage you, even though it can feel scary, it can feel like, especially if you're like aging out of the youth category, but yeah, just like try to make those connections and kind of let go of the power dynamics and just meet them where they are, essentially.
There's a question for Professor Duffy. You highlighted the surveys done in Canada, UK, and Australia, but have you examined the effects of this work, or has similar work been done in other global contexts, particularly perhaps not high-income contexts?
Yeah, the honest answer is no. We are just building this program of work from this joint work with Origin Institute in UK and Australia and Canada next, and I think it'd be fascinating to take it more widely, following on from that session in a different context. I mean, more generally in the generational analysis that we do try to cover lots of different contexts, not just types of countries like Canada and Australia. And it is different in those different contexts, and you can see that a lot in the international studies. And one of my other roles is I run the World Values Survey in the UK, and the World Values Survey is an awesome resource about changing attitudes and values that covers 120 countries it's up to now across its whole history, but it's 80 countries a year, and they are really useful for getting different types of perspective on those. So yeah, couldn't agree more. Not on this particular study, but would love to roll it out more.
Thank you. Let's go with a question from the back there.
Hi, I'm Fiona. I'm from Australia, fellow young person. Just want to say thank you so much for sharing all of your perspectives, whether it is from a personal lived experience lens or if it is from research. I think it's just so validating. It's these themes that come up in conversations I have, that I want to have, that I've had both in this conference and presentation, but also outside. So just want to say a big thank you. My question, I don't know if it's really towards a specific speaker, more you can kind of disperse amongst yourselves, but it was more so around, so for a bit of context, in Australia, we've just had federal legislation passed where social media would be banned. For those under 16s, there are some exceptions, but it's kind of this growing conversation around social media risks and harms, unfortunately. I think there's conversations happening in Quebec. There's, I think, legislation happening in Florida to the same degree. And I'm just really curious to hear from your perspectives how would you envision, communities, young people, service providers adapting to fill in the role that social media has previously played in their lives, given that, say, I'm a multicultural young person, I use social media to connect with other young people from multicultural backgrounds, to understand, to share stories, and to advocate. But I'm really curious to hear from your perspectives. Do you see any alternative platforms or kind of approaches being used? Thank you.
Huge question. Who would like to go first?
Yeah, I think I could say from an observational standpoint, we see that even outside of even generations or age groups that happen across, even post-COVID, more people are opting out of social media to step into kind of more in reality IRL activations and functions and things as points of social interaction. So it's going to be an interesting point to see how even with Gen A, Gen B, how that begins to translate and change. And I think in due time, we begin to see where those touch points are. And it's a moment of finding where those nodes are and how they're operating and moving around those that will be exciting to see.
Maybe we'll take a question from the online, and this one's for you. Do you think the changes in hope and optimism associated with climate crises or pandemics or wars could partially explain changes in mental health rates or outcomes? So it's kind of like, on the one, like generational changes in hope and optimism and the role that could play in mental health rates and outcomes.
Yeah, I think it's a hugely important part of the context. And I think what's strange is how quickly we got used to the sense of generation on generation progress post-war in Western countries, but then in less developed countries since then too, that it's just going to get better and better. And then you can see the echoes of this in different countries as wage stagnation and the lack of progress started to hit, where it kind of happened more for Gen X and then early millennials in the US, and then it really hit millennials, say, in places like the UK, who were promised a better future, did all the things they were supposed to be doing, much more going to university. They were the generation that took off, and then the economic reality just hit, and they did not get that sense of progress from it. So I think there is a reality of a promise, an intergenerational contract that has been broken. A very implied, but a very strong sense of things should get better. And I mean, a lot of my work is more political and more about democratic renewal and this democratic systems and how does that work. And the key issue there is this is not just a problem for young people, it's a problem for society, because we're deeply connected up and down the generations through our families, and it deeply matters to me as a parent and eventually as a grandparent whether my kids are going to do better or worse than me. So it's not just young people who are questioning, have a very pessimistic view of the future and think this is going wrong. It's all of lots of society are thinking, actually, but this isn't working, and that's the space that is then left for people who say the system isn't working, let's rip it up and start again, because we haven't got that sense of progress. So I do, in that context, it's like not at all surprising that people are, young people's mental health, who are going to have to live through more of this, is hit by that. There was a great tweet from Saturn Sangera the other day. You just did open your social media, tales of death and despair and everything going downhill. Look on mainstream media, tales of death and despair, everything going downhill. UK minister says we're overdiagnosing mental health disorders. There's a kind of contrast of this. It's sort of like, what is the other? There is no more sensible reaction than to feel a bit of despair to the context in which lots of people are living. So yes, I do think pessimism, that sense, is both real in economic terms and both cultural in terms of it's a big contrast. It's a big shock to us to think there is no automatically better future, and that is a tough thing for us to take.
Thank you for that.
Shall we come to the front for the next question?
Sure, thank you. I was the one who asked the question about hope and optimism as well, so thank you for that. I had another question for the other speakers. I'm sorry, but there was I was wondering, you mentioned how there's this new mix of individualism and collectivism that is coming out in this generation for South Asians specifically. And I was wondering, have you ever put any thought into like what kind of label would you attach to that new term for like what does it look like? What does it feel like? What is it like? I'm just wanting to characterize that a bit more.
Yeah, no, great question. Look, feel, these are like user experience questions that I'm so used to, but I think it's interesting. What I meant by that is that we come from kind of like this familial oral tradition, traditional structures, and a lot anecdotally in the South Asian community. I also work across different cultures, and again, internet culture is so interesting. And the ways that people, Beauregard talks about this idea of a hyper reality, and to where people are so digitally inclined now that they're thriving in spaces that aren't even cemented in the physical. You could shut that phone off, and you're totally disconnected. And so it's an interesting. I don't know what the word is to describe, but it allows this like unique bridge to be made, and it hasn't yet been completely synthesized. But there's a really cool opening between that, and again, to have a cultural framework like a South Asian framework that hasn't yet found its way fully into that natively is where it's interesting to see kind of that cohesion that can happen.
Thank you.
So maybe we can take one more from you've been.
Yeah, hi, I'm sorry, Gareth from the UK. I'm struck by the fact that at this conference, we're really recognizing that youth mental health is a systemic issue, that the problems are multifactorial and systemic, but most of what we're doing is interventionist, trying to patch it. And Bobby, your slide where you're saying, a minister saying, you're telling me it's all complicated and that we need to change everything. What if we do need to change everything? And that's the solution. How do we engage with policymakers and actually get them to engage in that conversation about the much bigger change we actually need to make if we're going to fix this?
Yeah, no, that's the challenge.
It's a small question.
Yes, thank you for that. No, I think, look, part of the reason we do what we do on this is to explain to the politicians the public opinion context on this, because that does drive a lot of their thinking, that people recognise that there isn't one simple lever you can pull, so you're not going to get the credit for that. This is not job done from your perspective. So I think engaging with the politics of the policy is really important, and that's, we do a lot of that at the Policy Institute at King's, because politics and policy is so intertwined. You need to view it from their point of view. But yes, then the point is we have got multiple really difficult circumstances that are all impacting on this crucially important area of policy that is directly affecting people's lives. And I do think, like Pat and the people on the Lancet Commission do a really good job of laying out the different aspects of, yes, we've got this really big picture thing that is causing this, but there's still service provision elements to this and service structure elements to this that will really help, and we are not doing those things. So I think it's not a message that is it's not just one message of, look, the public also agree with this, so you have to engage with that complexity. I think that is an important message, but then there are lots of practical things that are still can be done in cases that still can be made for better provision and reaction to this. And so I think that work is important in the detailed policy engagement and all that really important work around not viewing this as an adolescence and then handing over to adulthood, and then all of the disjunctures that you get in that is as fertile ground there from lots of the data that we're showing that does show that it's teens all the way through to late 20s and mid to late 20s that you need to be thinking through. So I think there's particular structural things, service provision things that can be done while we're trying to sort out the whole world in the meantime. Yeah.
Thank you. The next question is another very big one about loneliness and what we can do about it. And so this one will go to Avneet and to Abel. How do you think Western countries like Canada, Australia, or the UK, how can they learn from South Asian communities about connection and community? And there's this particular collectivist framework that Avneet mentioned. How can we learn from that?
That is a very big question. I think the biggest way, like I mentioned again before, is actually going in and being with the community and just having more diverse voices. Like even right now, like I'm sure all of you learned more about the South Asian community and how we function and like what's important for services. But I think, sorry, I'm reading the question again.
What would you say, what are some of the things that from knowledge and frameworks that your community knows really well, what is it that you would say other countries like Canada could take on that would otherwise be focusing on the individual? What would you advise them?
Yeah, I think one is being in service. I think across our culture, regardless of religion or even, again, being South Asian, that's a very broad term. There are subsects and, again, different things like location and language, dialect, and even religion play a huge role. But I think one thing that unites us across all those things is service. And again, when we think about collectivism, again, originally it's this idea of the whole rather than the individual. And so playing into that in the service and again, this like pack. Sometimes that pack mentality is commonly, it's a little bit scary. But on the other side, there are great benefits to taking care of one another and looking out for each other and the unknowns of that, unknowns of that. And so I think, that idea of service is really important. And it's a really fundamental pillar in South Asian communities that I think, is really close to the heart of those communities and play a really important role.
Avneet, anything to add? Does this resonate?
Yeah, just off of what Abel said, like being from a Punjabi family, like the concept of seva, which is like of giving and serving, is really important. And I've seen the Punjabi community come together in so many ways, whether that's like the farmers' protest, whether that's like being in East Hastings and like serving the community and just understanding how those little things can come together and how we serve people as a group, and then also just taking it back like within the families. Like I think we do a really good job as a community to come together for like causes and stuff, but then when we go back home it goes back into like more of the negative sides of collectivism or within families. So I think as a South Asian and then for other communities as well, like what we do within our external community to bring that back at home as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe just thank you, Abel, also for highlighting that when we're talking about South Asia, it's really not a monolith. And we are referring to South Asians often in this conversation, South Asians in Canada or in several high-income countries, immigrants, but there's an entire South Asia that is in Asia, and within South Asia there are so many diversities. So thank you for pointing that out. And part of what you're also referring to throughout, I think, and it was also something. I think individualism and collectivism also are not, like entire societies don't embody one or the other. That's partly what you're trying to talk about, and maybe it's something to keep in mind, that there could be multiple parts of the spectrum within societies that are individualist and collectivist, and even within the same community, there isn't one way of being. There could be different things that you approach with an individualist way, and there are other things that you approach collectivist. Maybe we can take one from there.
Hi, this is Laya. Kind of building on what you were saying earlier about Abel, about just kind of location and religion and divide. I think just growing up in India and just knowing the politics of India a little bit, I know that we have the caste system, we have communal divide, there's like so much going on right now, but it's always gone on for like centuries, right? So I'm just wondering, and as the diaspora, as we come here, we bring that with us. We don't take the structures, keep that back home, and we bring those structures with us and that segregation as well with us. So I'm wondering, when we say collectivist, it can sometimes also be very hyper-collectivist. It's very like my community, my caste, my like religion of people, right? And I know you also mentioned that, again, we're not a monolith. We kind of come with all of this multifacetedness, right? So I'm just wondering, when we talk about collectivist culture, how do we bring some nuance into it? How do we kind of also bring a nuance around hierarchy into it and make sure that we're addressing our own biases and privileges?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. I think one of the initial things that comes to mind, as we mentioned, the diversity, and again, you highlighted that journey. One of the biggest things, like I said, that comes to mind is fragmentation. That's really interesting, as even that journey from the motherland into the diaspora that then fragments and splits and splits and splits, and then you get a really small group that cares about certain things and there's certain values. And I think that fragmentation really leads to a how question. And again, like Avneet mentioned, being on site, being with these groups, understanding the nuance of these groups are really important to understanding true problem set issues and things that they care about, that hierarchy, like you mentioned, that might be valid to one group, but might not be to another. And you can kind of utilize that in understanding to see how we approach those things. And that's kind of how I begin to kind of question and see how we can look into that. Again, that fragmentation, again, oftentimes is used to divide, but how do we utilize that now, realizing how,
There is one more question there in the back, so let's go with that one.
Hi, this question is for Professor Duffy. I asked this question as a clinician, a psychiatrist, and someone who does research in suicide rates among youth, and especially in Canada. But I've looked at other populations, and what struck me about the survey that you presented today is I was wondering if the answers in public opinion, according to your thoughts, would be different if you replace the word mental health problems increasing with suicide. And the reason why is because sometimes that's explained as the real, like to your point about is this real? Well, people will explain that it is real because look at the suicide rates, they are rising, and indeed they are, there's no denying that. But I'm curious about your thoughts on whether the public opinion reasons for the rises in suicide rates would be different. And especially because we don't have a suicide national strategy here in Canada. And it's one of the biggest differences between the UK, the Australia, and Canada. And in your survey, where we just don't have that. And it makes me think, well, if public opinion is somehow different here, and that's why the government isn't listening to those of us that are trying to speak very loudly. Okay, Thank you.
No, really good question. And honest answer is, again, I don't know. It's the sort of thing that you could do really easily through split sample experiments to test what does the framing do to people's responses. I suspect it would have some impact, but not hugely change the patterns in this, because people have quite lightly held views based on mostly what they'll have seen in the media. It's interesting because I look much more at in the book at suicide as a generational claim in the media, because there is relentless coverage of a suicide epidemic in different eras, regardless of when you're looking at, because headline writers and press release people will take whatever kind of cut you can make of it to make it look quite dramatic. So in a UK context, yes, suicides have gone up in recent years, but when I was doing lots of the analysis, they had been going down after very high levels among my generation in Generation X, which looks like a true cohort effect rather than a change, because that pattern has followed us throughout life stages, where Gen X in a UK context have got much higher rates of suicide and deaths of despair more generally than the norm at different age points. But what was really interesting is that the media's presentation of that didn't really reflect it. And it's just, you can go to any era and they will always find a way to talk about this as a suicide generation, which will affect public opinion, which the reason I'm focusing on that media aspect of it is it does drive that sense of public opinion. So to answer you, I don't know. I don't expect it would have shifted people's views of what the drivers are and and whether it's real or whether it's something just about it within the generation itself. I think we'd have seen quite similar patterns if we'd asked that. But it's a great thought to do some more work on experimenting with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please go ahead.
First of all, thank you to all the three speakers. I think it was very interesting and riveting conversation and presentation. I have a comment to tie in a couple of the other questions and a question for you, Bobby. I think, so I come from India, and I stand here as an upper caste man with a lot of caste privilege. I also work in the mental health and suicide prevention space, and I do see this idea of collectivism, which is often a cause of immense violence, oppression, including suicides, and suicide specifically in the context of students who belong to Dalit communities, oppressed caste communities, including Adivasi and indigenous communities. And I think it's important to bring that up as an Indian, given that we are standing on unceded indigenous territory, which we respect and acknowledge, to also say that in a country like India, we too have occupied the lands and the cultures of indigenous people and Adivasis. So to say that collectivism is probably not as neutral an idea, and for us to also problematize it, is I think an important fact that we must be thinking about across the world, not just in South Asia, because we're seeing this every single where. The question for you, Bobby, is that we've spoken about intergenerational conflict, but I think when we speak of young people, we also have to acknowledge that youth is also not a homogeneous group. There are hierarchies within youth, within contexts, within India, within Canada, across the world, between the global north, between the global south, so on and so forth. I wanted to know if you have any insights from your own work around within generational conflict amongst young people themselves. And how does that relate to ideas around well-being, and how do we potentially begin to think of approaching all of that?
Yeah, really good point. And I have to say, just on your first comment, it's really enjoyed the presentation and the discussion on problematizing that sense of collectivism, because a lot of our focus is on the dangers of individualism, but making sure that we understand the dangers of collectivism, the negative effects of that, is really important in those types of discussions. Sorry, remind me the second bit. I was too involved in that bit. What was your second question? What was your actual question?
My question was, how do you understand conflict
within generations? Yeah, no,
especially young people.
Such a good point. It's such a key point. And look, so the answer to the question of does when you're born shape who you are is yes, it does, in many important ways, in the sense of if you're born into the same socioeconomic circumstances in places like Canada or UK, Australia, your chances of owning your own home are massively different compared to if you were born 20 years before or after a certain date. So it does have an influence on you. But that is not to say at all that it trumps division and difference within each cohort. These are massive cohorts of people who have incredible range of different circumstances. And I I suppose one of the main purposes of the book is to try to dispel the myth that you have to choose either generational explanations or more socioeconomic or structural explanations within generations. The whole point of this is that they interact in many ways, and it's becoming increasingly important to understand how they interact between them, because of that point of the enormous concentration of wealth among a particular cohort that's going to flow down incredibly unevenly, because some people have a lot and some people have nothing as part of that. And this is certainly, and then similarly when you look globally at the very different trajectories that different generations have gone on in different types of countries, when you're born is really important, but your socioeconomic status and other statuses within that country are also hugely important. So I think that's the key. That's one of the key things that I came to in lots of discussions with people, saying, why are you talking about generations? There's so much more diversity and divergence and conflict within generations than across them in many ways. I would say actually it's understanding the interactions between those two that is hugely important. And when I suppose in this sort of context, it is probably worth flagging one particular conflict within a generation, which is in Gen Z, and you've probably seen quite a lot of coverage of the the very strong divisions we're seeing between Gen Z men and Gen Z women on views of gender equality directly, but then more generally on political perspectives and political profiles. And that is unusual. And I mean, I spend most of my time dispelling generational myths and telling people to calm down on generational differences. But this is an unusual trend to see within a cohort, which usually move together. You're actually seeing Gen Z women and Gen Z men coming apart. And I do think that is an important thing for us to engage with sensitively, carefully. It's not just an Andrew Tate effect. There's more going on than that. But we need to be aware that Andrew Tate and others are filling a bit of a void there that we've left for them, that they're exploiting for their own negative purposes. So we need to think and engage carefully on that type. If you're thinking about within generation conflict, that would be one that I would pick out.
We only have a few minutes left. Let's take one more question from the front.
Thank you. So my question is also for Bobby. So thank you, really interesting. So in looking at generational trends, I'm wondering if you've explored at all changes in mental health literacy across generations, and assuming that there is increased literacy amongst younger generations, which I suspect anecdotally would likely be the case, and that we know that community support, parental support is a really important protective factor, especially for marginalized young people. What approaches might we take with older generations who maybe know that have a bit more mental health literacy than perhaps their parents, and know that they'd like to play that supportive role, but just don't have the literacy, and specifically don't have the literacy about what it means to talk to young people about that? So wondering if you can speak to that.
Yeah, great question, and I'm sure other panelists have helpful thoughts on that too. But I mean, yes, generally, so increased mental health literacy and openness is definitely a period effect that has influenced younger people more because they're at an earlier stage in their formative development. So it's much more natural, and they are much more literate than older generations, because it's much more, it's what they were brought up with, which is much harder for my generation and older generations who see this period effect, want to engage in it, but were brought up in a different time when that wasn't the case. And it's quite hard to lose that sense for lots of people. So I think that it's such a good question on, as that moves through and has become the norm for people at a younger age, as they age, will they take that on to be more supportive to their kids and then their kids' kids? So I think that is that is how generational norms shift. That's how societal norms shift, is through that generational transmission of a period effect through generation who thinks it's really natural, grows up with it, and then takes it with them. And that is a really important. So I think that there is a brighter future as that literacy feeds through into people who are bringing up their own kids more and more, but it will take time. How we support it, maybe other panelists have a...
Do either of you want to comment on this last question?
Avni, what do you think?
To be honest, I don't know. I think that's a really big question, and it's a lot more work and understanding for myself to do in that space. So I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, I think it requires a lot more leaning into that and seeking. I think the idea of nuance again comes to mind, of really checking into that and seeing, where those lie. So
maybe if I can add,
Yeah.
Thank you for this. Part of what you mentioned in your slides is the need for kind of also combating generational segregation. I do think that even mental health literacy or many such conversations, if we can create more spaces, whether it's about climate change or action or climate change, mental health literacy, that do bring intergenerational dialogue and connection and problem solving together, I think that that might be an avenue to see the sort of change that we want that happens across generations.
I'm aware that we need to close, but there's a really good question in the online chat. So just very briefly, to bring it together, if Avneet and Abel, you could comment on how to bring together collectivism and individualism in Canada. So how would you advise to work with South Asian young people, how to address that question of collectivism in mental health care? Just like brief keywords, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's about starting early, and that's something that I heard from a lot of the young people too, is like getting families involved and hearing from sources that family trusts. So whether that's at the temple, whether that's at a religious location, whether that is at school. And then I think going moving forward, like simply just from mental health literacy, because I think in the South Asian community, I do see a lot of discourse and conversation around like what is anxiety, what is depression, but I think more like helping families and parents understand that, okay, you know what anxiety is, you know what depression is, but let's talk about what's happening at home and this idea of collectivism and like maybe these generational things that they're holding on to, what effect does that have? And I'm seeing that even in my own family, like one of my aunt, as she says, is learning how to reparent. Because she knows what anxiety is, she knows about suicide, she knows all the facts. But that's not enough for her to understand how her actions and how she maybe was parented and is bringing it through is impacting her daughter. So this idea of reparenting almost herself.
Thank you. Abel?
Yeah, one small thing I would mention too, as was mentioned before, is that it's not mutually exclusive. These frameworks can be intertwined in different ways, and I think, like we mentioned, intergenerational dialogue is important. Different communities coming together is important to where we can champion what needs to be championed and call out what needs to be what is problematic, and really come to those conclusions. I think that's where that isn't mutually exclusive at all.
Thank you, everyone. And if you can join me in giving our session speakers a round of applause.